once again to another episode of History Now. On today's show we're going to be looking at religious history, specifically the cultural history of God. Joining me today from Exeter University is Professor Francesca Stavrakopoulou. Francesca has a new book out. It's a fantastic book called God and Anatomy, and it's been called Cultural History on a Grand Scale. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Francesca Stavrakopoulou to History Now. Francesca, thanks very much for joining me. I really appreciate it, and I just want to say at the beginning, congratulations on the book. I really loved reading it. It's something that's really been of interest to me for a long, long time, and I'm just really delighted to have the opportunity to read it.
Thank you so much, and thank you for reading it. Thank you for having me on.
So just to begin, I want to ask, it's called God and Anatomy, and you approach it through the different body parts of God. Why did you want to do this approach rather than, from geographically or historically?
Because essentially, in a lot of ways, this is a book about the cultural origins and history of God, the earliest history of God. And normally those sorts of discussions, both in scholarly publications and in more popular debates, TV programs and popular books, they tend to be much more linear and much more sort of, they take a narrative approach. And so even though I'm sort of telling this story about the earliest origins of this deity and how he shifts and changes over time, both sort of theologically and culturally, historically and socially, I kind of wanted to get away from the very conventional sort of, old white man approach to history, which is telling a story from the beginning and moving forward. But it also seemed to me that what I'm trying to do in the book is to say that, even though the God of the Bible is the God claimed by Judaism and Christianity, that this God was almost like a different kind of species of deity than the idea of gods as we understand them today. And so that was another reason for wanting to really do something that hopefully encourages the reader to engage with this deity in a much more personable way. And obviously it's about using his body as a means of mapping this discussion I have about who he is. And it seemed to me that doing an anatomy just kind of made him more of a real sort of being, despite the fact that he's an imaginary character, of course.
In the introduction, you talk about there was a God who ate, breathed, slept, and appeared. So how did we get from a point where you had, this lifelike God to a God that, was invisible and didn't appear to anyone?
I think human beings, as very social animals, we have this extraordinary capacity to imagine otherworldly beings. And it's that particularly interested me. We could still do the same things with the dead. We still do that today. Imagine we have continuing social bonds with them, much as ancient people seem to have that same capacity. And so I think the origins of this deity, he was very much cast, as most deities were, cast as being human-like or human-shaped. And human beings use their own bodies and the sociality of their own bodies to frame these otherworldly beings. So that was very much the origins of this deity. And a lot of biblical scholars would agree that it seems likely that this was originally a deity who was imaged in concrete material terms. So, figurines and statues were used in his temples. Hence, you later on get the ban that this God cannot be imaged as a material object, that this God is somehow very other. And a part of that was trying to differentiate the God Yahweh from other ancient deities in surrounding nations. So differentiate him from Egyptian deities, Babylonian deities, etc. But it was also partly through the loss of what we might loosely call sort of a more direct social relationship with the cult statues in temples, when the Jerusalem temple in particular was destroyed in the 5th century BCE by the Babylonians. A lot of the elites of that particular city at that particular time were taken off into exile in Babylon. And so they were completely dislocated from their normal ways of engaging with their deity. And it's those high status groups who lie behind a lot of the biblical literature that's in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. And so with that kind of dislocation from the temple and the cult statues that they normally would engage, which were not all, permanently put on show all the time. The hiddenness of the gods was very much a big thing. Think about the ways that certain statues in some forms of Christianity today are sort of paraded around at particular festivals, it would have been something similar. So the deity, the statue, was not always seen. So there was always a hiddenness, if you like, to the divine. But it's that emphasis on the hiddenness of God that gets more and more emphasized theologically, as a means of trying to cope with the fallout from this dislocation from the temple and from the normative religious practices of the temple.
But there are people in there, deities in there, who are related to, the Christian, Judeo-Christian God. You're talking about, that image disappearing, but there are other people in there who disappear, and I'm thinking of Asherah.
Yeah.
And Baal. Can you tell us who these people were in relation to God, and, why we don't hear of them anymore?
Yeah. Partly because of the Bible that we don't really hear of them, and its influence on the shaping of ancient Judaism and then ancient Christianity. But these were deities who were, ancient Israelite religion, and so this God Yahweh, they were born into a world which is kind of loosely known as the Canaanite world, Canaanite culture. So generally what we tend to think of as modern day Israel, Palestine, Western Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. And we can almost, as an academic, as I'm sure you know, it's really hard not nuancing and footnoting everything. But broadly speaking, we can talk about this kind of Canaanite culture. And the god El was the high god of this particular sort of northwest Semitic Canaanite culture. And he had a consort goddess, a wife, who was known in some dialects as Atherat and in Hebrew as Asherah. And as Yahweh worship gradually sort of took hold and became more popular, so the older god El, who was basically God's dad, Yahweh's dad, Yahweh sort of took on a lot of his roles and functions and temples and rituals and myths. And so gradually this deity kind of disappeared. But Yahweh did inherit his father's mother, his father's wife, if you like, Asherah. We have inscriptions that talk about Yahweh and Asherah from the 8th century BCE. But basically we're talking about the shift from a bog standard, very common form of polytheism, so the worship of many gods, so they're all structured in a pantheon, a shift to sort of what some scholars used to call an emergent monotheism, but really is better understood as like pantheon reduction or even monolatry. So the understanding that there are lots of different gods, but you only worship one deity. And that's what we begin to see when the biblical texts are first being compiled and reworked and curated. It's this kind of theological tendency towards a monolatrous way of viewing the divine that's in the ascendancy. And it's those theologies that have shaped the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, which then obviously came to shape earliest Christianity as well.
Once we get to the different body parts of God, we'll begin with the feet. In my head, as I was reading this section, I just couldn't get, the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade about the path of God and things like that out of my head. That's just by the by. But, feet and footstools are a prominent part of this section. Could you explain to us what's the importance of the footprint of God, the imprint of God, and footstools in terms of social order and hierarchy? Because I found that really, really fascinating.
Yeah, so I think the feet, we're so, as modern people, we're so accustomed to wearing shoes like outdoors, and kind of we don't experience the world in the same way that our ancestors experienced the world. They didn't just use their feet, for moving about. They used their feet to tread grapes and to measure time and distance. They were much more foot focused than we are. And religiously speaking, the feet played an important hierarchical role, because there was this sense that the human world, the earthly realm, wasn't as divorced or divided or separated from the otherworldly kind of context. The heavens were understood to be in the skies above, and beneath the earth there was the underworld, which wasn't a bad place. It's just where you went when you died, and continued to have this kind of social existence. But there wasn't this kind of huge yawning chasm of a gap between the earthly realm, where humans live and exist, and the world of the gods. And so the idea that a deity could manifest in that human world was really important. And obviously we're talking about imaginary beings here. Personally, I'm an atheist, but essentially we're talking about imaginary beings. But the way in which the landscape was held to reflect the sort of meeting point in certain places, certain special places, the meeting point between the heavenly realm and the earthly realm, And it was understood that, the gods were understood to place their feet there. So, mountaintops are obviously very obvious locations for locating the divine, not just in ancient biblical cultures, but in ancient Greek cultures and Mesopotamian cultures. So it's that sense that the placement of the feet manifests social presence that's really important. And then hierarchically, that kind of builds into, it reflects what's going on in the human realm. And so you get the sense that, footwear wasn't simply something that you wore to protect your feet. It was that they were, shoes were objects of status. I mean, look at Tutankhamun's sandals. I mean, he had something like over 80 pairs of sandals in his tomb, and some of them were ceremonial. They were never intended to be practical pieces of footwear. But, they showed him on the insoles of his sandals, his ceremonial sandals, trampling the trussed up bodies of his enemies. And it's that sense that people in positions of power, particularly kings, could trample their enemies into submission. They're riffing off the same idea that the gods themselves trample their enemies into submission. They trample chaos into order. So the feet are body parts of huge power. And it's that I tried to talk about at the beginning of the book, to kind of explain just why feet were so important in the divine realm.
There are the footstools are very interesting. They're found in a lot of the temples. Does that, give the people who put them there status as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, temples are high status buildings. And the idea to impose order in the earthly realm, so that those that were, kings and priests who built temples, who maintained temples, they were demonstrating their kind of godlike ability, if you like, to impose order, architectural order in the world, just as the gods imposed architectural order. The idea was very much across ancient Southwest Asia that the gods literally built the cosmos and imposed order. Everything has a place and everything should be in its place. And that same ideology underscores exactly what's going on when kings and priests and other, and dignitaries, elites basically, when they built the landscape as well, when they built the urban landscape in particular. I mean, temples are always very urban centres. So yeah, for anybody who is engaging with, in a sacred space that a temple marks, the place where a deity sets their feet, they are necessarily enjoying this very privileged position and status within the cosmos themselves, at the feet of this deity.
If we could move on up the body now, there's a section which is, it's the whole book's fascinating, it really is, but something that's probably not talked about as much, and that is the genitals.
Yeah.
Now, you juxtapose, the sort of the hang-ups that people of faith, Christianity, Judaism, have in relation to, genitals, but you juxtapose that with examples of the hypermasculinity of God. And could you talk a bit about that and how that relates to other, mythological beings in Southwest Asia?
Given our kind of very Christianized, whether we're Christian or not, we live in a very Christianized culture still. And there's a sense very much, at the heart of Christianity, modern Christianity, is Jesus, who is emphatically celibate, not sexually active. And yet he's also emphatically male. We get the one detail that we get, the one description of his body, apart from in the story of the Passion, where, a discussion about the wounds on his body at his crucifixion. The one real description we get of his body is that he was circumcised. And circumcision was a really important part of ancient Judaism. It's still a very important part of Judaism today. But even though we know that basically Jesus, he's cast as a man and has a penis, this is not a man who is sexually active at all, very, very definitely in terms of formal theological doctrine, at least. But that's a real difference between what Christianity became and the earliest origins of the God that of the God of the Bible. I mean, who is cast, was understood as being a male deity with genitals. He was a circumcised deity. That's why he's so keen for his followers, male followers, to circumcise themselves. But the idea to be somehow this sexually active deity wasn't seen as being something that somehow was reductive or too human. It was seen as being a real marker of a creator god, a fertility god. We tend to think of goddesses as being the ones in control of fertility, but that's because we've kind of subsumed all this misogynistic idea we have about female bodies into the idea that, oh, their purpose is to to give birth. Obviously women's bodies do far more things than that, but it was male gods. It was, fertility was very much a male attribute, both for humans and for deities. The biblical God is he sort of inherits those cultural mythological tropes, and was seen very much as this hyper-masculine deity who was able to impregnate, if you like, the world.
Moving on to, the body, the torso of God, there's a lot of really interesting examples of, the importance of the torso of God. Can you give us a sense of what's in that section in terms of, how it's depicted and why it's depicted in such a way?
Yeah, I mean, I think most importantly, the torso, the inner organs of the human body were understood in the ancient world to be the seat of not just emotions, but also of thought, of thinking. So in the lower torso, so in the belly and the bowels, that was where emotions like compassion and love and joy were manifest and felt. So you get in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, you get the kind of lovely references and allusions to the rumbling sound of God's, inner stomach as he as he worries about, whether to inflict pain on people or not. But then the upper torso was the heart, and the heart was a cognitive organ. That's where rational thought was understood to occur, and that's where ideas are formed and shaped and felt. And so you often get, when you get references in the Bible to God changing his mind or making a decision, the English translations often hide the fact that actually the Hebrew is talking about what's happening in his heart. He literally has a change of heart. He thinks things in his heart. And so to talk about the torso of God in that way is really to engage his emotional inner life. Because, this was a social being as far as his ancient worshippers were concerned. And you can't have a social relationship with somebody that is emotionless.
Could you tell us, obviously we've established that God doesn't appear anymore, but there's something in the book which you talk about the dangerous glare of God's material form.
Yeah, the gods in ancient Southwest Asia, the gods were understood to be basically radiant beings, to give us this kind of a hot white or a hot red glow about them. It's a term that in the Hebrew Bible is often translated as glory, kavod, but it has this sense of a material quality. It's almost like, but do you remember Ready Brek? Yes. Like the Ready Brek adverts with the guy with like the red glow. That's always the way I kind of imagine it. It's almost like the gods had this Ready Brek glow about them. But it was this Ready Brek glow that they had, and it was almost like emanating out from their bodies. And so that idea of this divine brightness, obviously it dovetails with shared ideas that, the gods could also be manifest as, astral bodies, so the sun and the moon and the stars and that kind of thing. So that brightness, that light, is what seems to be encapsulated in this idea of their radiant bodies. But it also dovetails with the ways in which the cult statues of the gods themselves in high status temples were constructed. They were often a core of either sacred wood like tamarisk or say bronze, and then overlaid with shiny gold. And it's that sense of that glistening glare. Light was seen to be divine, and brightness and shininess, dazzling quality. That is to be divine. And obviously that carries on, in some New Testament traditions when we, read about these angels sitting in the empty tomb of Christ, and they're all glowing white. And in the book of Revelation, it's just, the skies the heavens are bright, bright white with this divinity. So that's, so God's body was human shaped and human like, but it was also very, very divine in the sense that it had the Ready Brek glow about it.
Can we talk about, the journey of God's arm? And what I mean by that, it's in its sleeping state with the fall of Judah to, you bring this in, and it talks about God's intervening in human existence, but then it looks at how that, sort of disappeared from society. I know that's a bit of a convoluted statement there, but it's really interesting. You show the journey of God's arm from someone who intervenes to a later state. Could you tell us about the social reasoning behind that?
we're talking about an imaginary being, right, in the ancient world as well as in the contemporary world, for some of us. And the fact is that to have this social relationship with a deity, obviously all of that body imagery for God in the Bible, it comes from the idea that people thought he had a body, but also just as we use our own bodies to talk metaphorically about anything. So theologians, even those that resisted the idea later of God having a body, they still used, God's body continued to exist, if you like, in a literary form, literary motif. So we often read about the hand of God, not just in the Bible, but, in much later theology. And it's the idea that God is an active deity. So he's not kind of this passive dude sitting on a cloud who creates the world in 6 days, has a rest, and then decides, right, I'm not going to intervene or engage with this creation anymore. So the idea that God is not just engaged in the world, but wants to play an active part in it is very much represented by what he does with his hands. And there's this fantastic poem in the book of Isaiah that's dated to about the 6th century, 5th century BCE. And it talks about those elites who were taken off into exile in Babylon with the fall of Judah in the 5th century BCE. And they're singing this hymn. They're saying, wake up, arm of God. And they're addressing his arm completely, saying this used to be the God who they used to image in statues with either his arm raised above his head, ready to smite down his enemies, or with his hand raised in a gesture of blessing and welcome. But they're saying your arm's asleep. We can't see this intervention in our world anymore. What's happened? Your temple's been destroyed. We've been taken off into exile. Have you abandoned us? Have you been godnapped or kidnapped by the Babylonians and taken off into exile? Have you been defeated? And the idea that God's arm was sleeping is a really powerful motif because it represents the idea, this theological crisis, that God was no longer willing or able to intervene, to rescue them from this kind of foreign captivity and to restore them and himself to the homeland. And so then later on, when the people do eventually return to Judah in the 5th century BCE, rebuild the temple, and imagine that Yahweh has returned as well. They talk about his arm being raised aloft again, like a warrior, or kind of like a fighter, like a champion. And he goes about smiting his enemies again and destroying the world. But it was such a powerful motif that even into the Common Era, up to about the 6th, 7th century CE, rabbis were still talking about, well, how could this disaster have happened? And they said that, God decided to allow his temple to be destroyed, both in the 5th century and then again in the 1st century CE by the Romans, because, it was a punishment. He was punishing his people. But the rabbis talk about the fact that he would have to bind his right arm behind his back. Even though he'd made this decision in his heart, he had to bind his arm behind his back to stop himself from intervening in helping his people, because this was a just punishment they had to suffer. And it's almost like the temple had to be destroyed to be rebuilt again, to be destroyed again. And so, his arm kind of and his hand become this really powerful motif mythologically and culturally and theologically that extends, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
Now, we've perhaps in this society and culture, we've got a preconceived notion of what God's face, a long beard and, the white flowing hair. This is something that you look at and goes back to the book of Daniel. Is the book of Daniel? Tell us how this version became reflected in the church building that occurred in, the first couple of centuries in Christianity. Because the really interesting argument that you make is that these depictions compensated for an absence of the image of God.
In the Iron Age, he was very much seen as a kind of a rugged warrior type guy. So kind of, and with all the kind of the classic attributes of male beauty. So in that particular culture, they were very, very dark hair with like a blue lapis lazuli sheen to it, and a kind of red glowing skin. So red because he's got the ready Brett glow about him, but also red because he was stained as a warrior. So this kind of ruddiness. And then you get to the book of Daniel and you get this extraordinary image of God sitting on his throne in chapter 7. And he's got white hair and a white beard, white as snow, white as lamb's wool. And this was very much the hair and beard of his father, the god Ale, all the way back. He was an elderly god, not because he was sort of physically degenerating, but simply because he was the senior deity. He was the oldest god in the cosmos, so he had a grey or white beard and white hair. So all of a sudden you get this kind of melding of this very much older iconography of the god Ale with the god Yahweh as this kind of rugged warrior type. But it's that passage in the book of Daniel that would become so important in early Judaism and Christianity. So it plays a big part in the development of a lot of Enoch traditions, but it also plays a huge part, obviously, in a lot of early Christian traditions. In the passage in Daniel, this young warrior cloud rider appears in the heavenly throne room of this white-haired god, and is given kingship over the heavens and the world. And so that's exactly what some early Christians thought that was God and Christ, basically, that God, the white-haired elder statesman of the universe, was handing over kingship of the heavens to Christ, this young warrior. And so that kind of idea that God the Father essentially was the white-haired bearded one, and that God the Son, or Christ, was the younger sort of dark-haired beauty, was very much replicated in a lot of early Christian art from the late 3rd century onwards, particularly. And it's not, so when you look at very early Christian images of Christ, for example, he's this gorgeous young guy. I mean, he's a very typical Mediterranean looking guy, olive skin, a short dark hair, beautiful, very youthful. But it's only when you start getting to the point at which Christianity has been endorsed by the Roman Empire. So it's become not just a permitted religious cult, but it's being promoted by Constantine. That then you start, and public churches are being built and financed by the empire itself, that you start to get these much more lavish portrayals of Christ and he gradually takes on these characteristics of a big bearded deity. He looks a lot more like Zeus or Jupiter, still often with this dark hair, but with the big bushy beard that he didn't have before. So it's almost as if he becomes more senior in status, like looks older, looks more regal, looks more imperial. He looks like an emperor in the heavens. And so, you can really sort of track this kind of shift in the divine face, if you like, from what was this kind of dark-haired, blood-stained warrior to this kind of old kind of dude with a big white beard and hair. And then see the ways in which those kinds of tropes are continued in early Christian iconography, so that God the Father ends up being the white-haired, white-bearded one, and God the Son ends up being bearded, because that's a masculine status, but still dark-haired.
Francesca, there's so much in the book that I think will interest many, many people. From someone who studies religion as well, it was an eye-opener for me. And what really comes across is how much of, what's in the Bible, really penetrates almost every aspect of society, including how we frame things, how we, words we use. It's a fascinating book, and I really do thank you for coming on and speaking to me today about it.
So grateful to you for having me on. Thank you so much. And I'm particularly chuffed that you enjoyed the book. I loved writing it, but you never quite know what it's going to do once it's out in the wild. Do you know what I mean? So I'm thrilled that you enjoyed it.
Francesca, thanks very much for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much.